Sometimes we can do everything right, PFDs, jacklines, multiple high-volume bilge pumps, but regardless of our efforts, Mother Nature has something else in store for us. This week, the story of sailing vessel Solution, lost in the Atlantic. Joint Base Cape Cod. The U.S. Coast Guard reports that Tuesday morning, their HC-144 and MH-60 responded to a sailing vessel in distress 220 nautical miles offshore of Cape Cod. Through flawless teamwork and expert skill, their crews were able to rescue the 4 passengers from the sinking vessel and bring them ashore to safety. Bravo Zulu to both crews. The Newport Bermuda Race is a biennial 635 nautical mile yacht race from Newport, Rhode Island to the British island of Bermuda. The race is the oldest regularly scheduled ocean race in the world and one of 2 regularly scheduled races held almost entirely out of sight of land. The race is particularly popular among current and retired members of the U.S. Coast Guard who regularly make up a significant portion of the participants. Solution was a 50-foot sloop which regularly competed in the race. Designed by K. H. Nielsen and built by Paul Luke of East Boothbay, Maine in 1963. She was expertly designed and solidly constructed for racing offshore in the North Atlantic with 2x2 laminated 8-ply white oak frames, double planking of 7/8 mahogany over 3/8 cedar, bronze floor timbers and reinforcing members, and a plywood deck with fiberglass sheathing. She's been maintained since the year 2000 to the highest standards by Rockport Marine and has undergone extensive replacement of structural members on numerous occasions whenever any questions as to her soundness were revealed by annual inspections. On July 2nd, during the return delivery from the 2024 Newport Bermuda Race, the crew of Solution abandoned their 50-foot sloop 200 miles south of Cape Cod and were safely rescued by U.S. Coast Guard helicopter. The following was a written account of what happened from Carter Bacon, the owner and captain of SV Solution. I sailed Solution with a crew of 7 others to Bermuda in the Newport to Bermuda Race, which began on June 21st. We arrived in Bermuda on June 25th after a fast but uneventful passage. On June 29th, I departed Bermuda at 3 p.m. with my daughter for the return passage to Solution's home port of Rockport, Maine. We had 2 additional sailors on board, Lewis and Clive Crooks. They were companionable and helpful and turned out to be cool and competent when the chips were down. We planned to sail north using modern weather prediction and communication tools to navigate as efficiently as possible through the anticipated Gulf Stream currents and weather patterns. My regular navigator, Jim Gabriel, assisted us with up-to-the-minute weather plots and sailing directions, which he sent from his home by satellite phone text message. At all times while on deck, the crew wore harnesses with inflatable PFDs and were tethered to jacklines or strong points. The passage began with moderate southerly breezes coming from directly behind us as we headed north. The wind was insufficient to give us the desired speed, and we proceeded under power with the mainsail set, making about 6 knots. We were carrying a roller furling Genoa jib on our headstay, which we deployed from time to time with little effect. As of 7 p.m. on June 30th, we were 150 miles north of Kitchen Shoals Reef, having averaged about 6 knots since our departure. During the next 3 hours, the southerly breeze freshened up until we were able to shut off the engine. Over the same period, we picked up a northerly warm eddy current of at least 2 knots. Our speed increased dramatically. We often hit 10 knots and we had uninterrupted good sailing under the mainsail alone for the next 24 hours. At 5 p.m. on July 1, we were 325 miles north of Kitchen Shoals, having covered 175 miles in the previous 22 hours for an average speed of almost 8 knots. At that time, we were experiencing steady winds of more than 20 knots. We were still sailing with a full mainsail and had rolled out the Genoa, which was giving us the added speed. The forecast indicated that winds would increase to 25 knots and then decrease and shift into the west over the next 12 hours, followed by increasing winds as we neared our planned exit from the Gulf Stream. Around 6 p.m., as precautionary measure, I put a double reef in the mainsail and we rolled in the Genoa, leaving only a small handkerchief rolled out for balance. Clive and Louise went below at 7 p.m., leaving my daughter and me on watch. Once below, Clive slipped as the boat lurched and hit his head on a cabin handhold. He told Louise and me that he was okay. In hindsight, it appears that he suffered a concussion. He went to bed shortly after the fall. The passage proceeded uneventfully, except for 2 hours of torrential rains, until early the morning of July 2. By the time we had left the warm eddy and entered a northbound meander on the Gulf Stream, which gave us continued benefit of a northerly current. After midnight, the strong winds, which had been pushing us steadily northward, abated somewhat and shifted from south to west, creating difficult sailing conditions with confused seas. In response, we started the engine, which gave us the power we needed to punch through the waves. I did not increase sail, expecting the strong winds would again materialize. The ride was uncomfortable. We bounced around, but there was no pounding, and we continued to make good time because we were riding a favorable current at the edge of the Gulf Stream. Around 1 a.m., I felt confident enough about the way the boat was behaving to go below. Clive and Louise came up to take turn on watch, and me and my daughter turned in. Clive said he felt okay with only a slight headache. At 3:30 a.m., after a few hours of motor sailing, the engine shut down. The cause was probably sludge from the bottom of the fuel tank stirred up by all the bouncing around. The engine started revving and slowing, a sign that its fuel supply was being choked off. It stopped on its own before it could be shut down. In a calm harbor with no rolling, I could replace the fuel filter and get the engine back online in 20 minutes. In a choppy sea, getting the engine restarted would be an almost impossible challenge. It would have to wait. We continued to sail without incident, although at a reduced speed now that we had lost the engine. At about 4 a.m., I joined Clive on watch in the cockpit. Louise retired to the cabin. I decided that we should head for Cape Cod, then 230 miles away, which was the closest shelter. This would take a day and a half off the time it would take us to get to safe harbor. I did not think I had a realistic chance of getting the engine running, and it would be only a matter of time before our batteries would run low if they couldn't be charged by the engine. It seemed dangerous to get all the way to Rockport. As the morning progressed, the wind continued to shift, as predicted, into the north. We were sailing close-hauled on the port tack in an ever more easterly direction. At some point, I tacked in order to put the boat on a westerly course toward Cape Cod. This course would take us out of the Gulf Stream, which promised to become more turbulent as the wind was increasing. I hoped we would get a favorable shift at some point that would allow us to fetch the Pollock Rip Channel into Nantucket Sound without having to tack. I also considered sailing directly to Newport if we could not fetch the Cape. As the sun rose, I set up the inner headstay and set a sail, a small jib, on that stay, providing solution with a balanced sail profile that served the boat well in a wide range of conditions. Clive was on the helm during these operations, which consumed at least half an hour. He steered well, keeping the boat reasonably level and avoiding crashing seas, so that I could work up on the pitching foredeck. Once the staysail was set, Clive returned to the cabin and my daughter joined me on watch. It was around 6 a.m. Shortly after Clive retired, Louise popped her head up through the companionway to tell me that Clive was nauseous and appeared to have a concussion, but he was conscious, calm, and cheerful. Louise had him tucked into his bunk and was caring for him. She was cool, collected, and all business. Clive was in good hands. The wind was increasing. I concentrated on trying to steer around the worst of the waves. By 7 a.m., the wind had increased substantially. The current was running fast, almost 4 knots, indicating that we were near the northern wall or boundary of the stream, where the current runs the fastest. The waves coming from the north were being stacked up by a southerly current. As we ascended a wave, solution would occasionally come down hard with a loud bang. Rather than an easy landing that we were accustomed to, this meant that she was landing more on her side than on her bottom. 2 of these bangs, which came sometime before 7:30 a.m., were the loudest and most bone-jarring I've ever experienced on any boat. I now believe that these hard landings opened a seam in Solution's hull. Suddenly, shortly after the last and largest of our hard landings, we were in calmer seas. Our instruments indicated that we had exited the Gulf Stream. The waves were still large and turbulent, but they were spaced out to their normal distance, and we were sailing fast upwind with an easy motion under a double-reefed main and a small staysail. However, the wind was also rising to a steady 26 knots with gusts to 30. The boat was heeled way over, and I felt there was too much pressure on the rig. I dropped the mainsail, the boat's angle of heel decreased, and we were sailing comfortably with plenty of speed with just a staysail, something Solution had done on a number of previous passages in similar conditions. We were just going to fetch Cape Cod. After dropping the mainsail for a few minutes under the staysail alone, I felt confident enough about our sailing situation to hand the helm over to my daughter and go below deck, where Clive and Louise were. It was a little after 8 a.m. Clive and Louise were secure in their pilot berths, but the cabin looked like a bomb had hit it. All kinds of gear and clothing crammed on the floor of the cabin where it had fallen during the time spent battling the waves. I heard water sloshing below the floorboards. I opened the engine compartment at the rear of the cabin and could see the water was quite deep in the bilges. I wasn't too concerned at first because the automatic bilge pump had been off, so I turned it on, expecting that the water would be pumped out in less than 10 minutes based on my previous experiences. I quickly picked up the cabin sufficiently to remove any hazards. I was then able to lift the floorboards around the cabin and check all the through-hull fittings that admitted seawater for various purposes. These all appeared to be in proper order with hoses attached. However, the bilges were so full of water I couldn't detect where any water might be entering the boat. Then I went back to the engine compartment to check on the pumping progress. The water had risen, not fallen, in spite of the high-capacity pump. As I watched, our emergency pump located above the primary pump was activated when the water level reached its float switch, but the level kept rising, although at a slower rate now because we had two large pumps going. I don't recall the exact capacity of these pumps, but they could each pump hundreds of gallons per hour, a number that seemed astounding to me when I installed them several years earlier. I checked to make sure that they were both running and then began a second search for the source of such a large leak. By then there was no way to even guess where the water was coming in. All of the bilge was underwater and water was coming over the leeward floorboards when we rolled. It could have been coming from anywhere. I was out of options. At 8:36 I called my brother Wells, an experienced pilot and sailor, on the Iridium satellite phone, which worked like a charm. What a relief. I told him the situation and asked him to notify the Coast Guard and take charge of all communications. Minutes later he called back with a phone number to a Coast Guard officer. I called the numbers and advised that an airplane and helicopter were being dispatched from Cape Cod 200 miles away. The officer directed me to activate Solutions EPIRB beacon. I did so at about 9 a.m. and placed the unit in a cup holder in the cockpit. I did not secure it to the boat. The plane arrived at around 10 o'clock a.m. and dropped a pump in the water near us. It had a 400-foot floating rope attached, which should have made it easy for us to sail close to it, pick up the rope, and reel in the pump container. However, when I tried to maneuver close to the rope, I found the boat unresponsive. We sailed right over to the rope and then spent an hour trying to maneuver back to it in the high winds and large waves. Solution was so sluggish, she would not come up into the wind for attack. Each time I wanted to change directions, I had to jibe, losing any windward distance I might have gained. Later I realized that we were so full of water that the kind of steering required was impossible because the boat was so sluggish. After we spent an hour or more trying to retrieve the pump, the Coast Guard pilot was flying in circles overhead and radioed to say that the helicopter would arrive soon, that it was at its maximum distance from base and carried only enough fuel to stay overhead for 50 minutes. He advised that our choices were to abandon Solution or allow the helicopter to deliver a second pump directly onto our deck. There was not enough time to do both. It was my choice. It was an easy but painful decision to abandon Solution. She was clearly sinking. I estimated that the water was rising an inch every 10 minutes, and it was now completely covering the floorboards, with 8 inches to go before it covered the main batteries located beneath the lower bunks in the main cabin. Once the batteries were submerged, there was no way to know whether or for how long they'd continue to provide power to the electric pumps before shorting out. Even if we got the bigger pump on board and got it ahead of the flooding, we would still have to make 200 miles without a pump failure through heavy adverse winds and seas, which were not expected to abate until late on July 3rd. There was no hope of restarting the engine until we reached calm waters, which meant that the batteries could not be charged to power our pumps, assuming we could even keep them from being submerged. I assumed we had hull damage and had no way to assess its extent or the increased rate of flooding that would result if we started to push the hull. If that wasn't enough, there was a crew member on board with a possible concussion. We had no choice but to go. I told the Coast Guard pilot we would be ready to move immediately when the helicopter arrived. When the helicopter arrived, the pilot directed me to turn 180 degrees and place the boat on an easterly course. After making this turn, the staysail was backed with the sheet pulling from the windward side. The boat moved along steadily at 1 to 3 knots without any further need for steering, allowing the helicopter pilot to gauge his approach. The actual rescue was at once dramatic and anticlimactic. Each of us jumped in the water in turn. A frogman was lowered, harnessed up to the victim, and the pair was hoisted 80 feet to the helicopter. I had watched this so many times on TV that there was nothing surprising except the tight grip of the harness. The competence and coordination of the Coast Guard crew was, not surprisingly, as close to perfection as humans get. The process was repeated 4 times, and the pilot headed for Cape Cod at approximately 12:15 p.m. As close to perfection as humans get, as we've come to expect from the men and women serving in the United States Coast Guard. The lesson in this for me is one of preparedness and experienced decision making. In his preparedness, Captain Carter Bacon had everything on board, from PFDs, jack lines, hard points for those jack lines, and safety gear, down to 2 high volume bilge pumps staggered so one was much higher in the bilge and would only trigger in a high water situation. He had an EPIRB, and the radio was operational, as well as satellite communications that he used to call for help. All things in place and all things well maintained and functioning, the powers of the sea still laid claim to his mighty vessel, and his final act in preparedness and expert seamanship was to make the impossible decision to leave solution to the sea. An impossible decision many captains have delayed in futile effort to save a ship, often at the cost of human life. Our hats are off to Captain Bacon, his crew, and most certainly the Coast Guard, who continue to save sailors from the might of ocean waters.